The poison build has a surprising secret in God of War Ragnarok. It can make even the toughest fights an absolute breeze without ever having to use anything but your fists, unless you really want to. I just finished testing this setup against some endgame enemies on No Mercy and was quite shocked when it ended up doing a lot more damage than some of my other builds I thought were already great. So let's dive right in, and as always, a sub to the channel would be awesome. Now this build takes advantage of the poison status effect, which debuffs enemies by lowering their power levels and thus their defenses. In turn, this buffs our own melee damage against them, which in the end will take off higher amounts of their health bars. Plus, the damage over time component is also quite nice. Against groups of enemies, we can spread the poison easily with the shield and the attachment options that we're going to check in just a little bit. And not only that, we have all the damage reflected back to the enemies that might hit our shields. I even tested this against the Valkyrie boss on the No Mercy difficulty just to see how it stacks up to the other ones, and to my surprise, it's now my fastest and easiest run I had on the No Mercy difficulty. Yes, I know it's not technically the highest, I'm working my way with a different save for that, but still just goes to show you how you can approach even the toughest challenges in all kinds of different builds. Now to get this setup going, we're using the Lunda armor set that you can get around the middle of the game from these 3 locations once you completed the story part in Vanaheim. And it is totally worth it even if you use it way into the late game. The chest piece is going to be the most important, making bare-handed attacks, parrying as well as blocking to have a high chance of dealing bonus damage, as well as poisoning enemies, thus lowering their power levels as I've said. Going with the full set can be very beneficial, as the waist and the wrist armor further buffs our damage against enemies that were previously poisoned, and it does so by a considerable amount, 40% just with the set bonus. This is the reason why you likely see health bars melting much faster between the lower power level and the extra melee damage, but there's a few more things we're gonna add on top to make it even stronger. There is going to be an end game alternative version of this build that uses slightly different items, and in that case we're gonna make use of the set bonus from the dragon scale armor instead. And it will be worth it because the set bonus is even stronger. We get the Dragon Rebuke, which increases all shield damage, not just against poisoned enemies, but against every enemy, and it does so by 50%, not just 40%. Given how 3 of the 4 light chain combos are actually dealt with the shield rather than with the bare fist, this is actually worth it. I even went ahead and tested this against the previous setup on the same boss, and you're not losing any damage at all. In the longer run, you're actually gaining quite a bit. And especially so since in some boss encounters, the poison effects tend to fade out quicker than against normal enemies, so having that extra bit outside of the buff window is quite nice. Plus, it also comes with the unique effect that makes blocks and parries now deal shield damage to nearby enemies, making this a great setup against groups as well, not just single targets. If you tend to get overwhelmed by enemies, you can just sit idly with a stone wall and let them damage themselves by just hitting the shield, which in turn makes them receive a portion of that damage while also getting poisoned. This brings us to our weapon choices, and the only ones we're actively using are, well, the shield / bare fists. As I've said, favoring the stone wall for this build, especially for its block potential against large groups, but I also wanted to remove any possible risk you could have from using other examples such as the Dauntless. For the higher difficulties, while it's not super needed, I hear that this is what most people prefer, so that's why I chose to include it. The attachment we're going to use with this is the Round of Affliction, which works both in single target situations, but it's even better against groups. The buff we get is called Strike of Affliction, and whenever you do shield strikes by double tapping L1 against enemies already afflicted by any status, this will consume that effect and do an elemental damage explosion. In action, it looks something like this. If you apply the status effect, be it poison or anything else, once you do the shield strike, the status gets consumed, dealing some extra damage as a result. That's why you want to aim to strike just as the poison effect is about to expire to get the extra bit of damage on top before reapplying it with your normal attacks. There's a second hidden effect that the elemental explosion has though, and that's the fact that it itself can also debuff nearby enemies. So for example, let's say there's only one debuffed enemy with a poison. If you do the shield strike, you will consume it and then spread it to all nearby enemies. It's theoretically even possible to do this endlessly without ever having to completely reapply the entire poison effect, as long as the strike is enough to spread to the nearby targets. You can get, of course, the Round of Affliction in the cave south of the desert in Alfheim. All you have to do is to complete these vine puzzles, and there's going to be a golden chest that gives you that item. The other weapons we're not really going to use much, neither the axe, blades nor spear, as they would mean just wasting buffs and losing on DPS, though there is one exception, and that's really when you want a quick runic power cast before moving back to bashing enemies with the bare hands. In terms of attachments, the Vanaheim set is the best here, further buffing melee damage against status afflicted enemies, and our enemies will almost always have the status from the poison, so you will get a very high uptime on that. As I've said, we also have lots of stun capabilities with this build, so the Svartalfheim also works great, buffing the stun damage inflicted based on our defenses, which isn't too shabby with this setup. And finally, I went with the Niflheim one in case you just want more melee damage. If you're above 75% HP, this is going to buff that even more, also based on the defenses. In terms of the strategy, it's pretty straightforward, as we're going to use the shield bashes to poison the enemies and get the buffs ASAP. As soon as that happens, you'll see the enemy HP dropping in levels right away. So if it was purple, indicating a large difference over you, it will now drop to orange. And similarly, if it was orange, it will now drop to green, and so on. That's why you'll want to make sure that the entire circle gets filled and not judge it by the visuals that pop on the character model from the first few blows. And once you get the 4 attack combos in place, usually bosses will start moving away so that they can start doing their whole attack chains. In this case, what I do on the exact 4th attack is to preemptively cancel with the dodge so that I can move closer to them and then do a quick running jump against them and just begin the whole process again, interrupting them and reapplying the poisons. When that's not possible, this is where the shield comes in to save you, blocking great amounts of damage, but be careful and do not wait for it to turn completely red, otherwise even any following yellow attacks will be enough to break your stance and opening you up to a ton of incoming damage. So in this case, maybe dodge away, unleash the strike, refresh it, and you can then start blocking again. Anyway, this is pretty much it with the build. If you enjoyed it, a like on it would be great, and if you really enjoyed it, a sub to the channel would be amazing. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.